Pathways to Prosperity Partnership and the Canadian Immigration Historical Society present Reflections from the Past.
We spent time speaking with Mike Molloy, Girard, and Gerry van Kessel. And after having heard from them individually, we thought it would be really interesting to put their very excellent minds and thoughts together and have a more general discussion about some of the themes and some of the issues that were raised in their individual conversations. So we're going to spend some time just talking amongst ourselves. And we're going to start off with the general question around all the years of experience that we have sitting at this table and all the hours of your lives that you have spent discussing refugee and humanitarian issues and all of the passion that you've brought to these issues, trying to do what is best for Canada. Talk to us about, have a discussion amongst yourselves. What have we learned? Have we really advanced the system? Have we got to where we need to be as a country? How have we really progressed as we look at refugee policy issues and resettlement? Are we recycling things, ideas that we had back in 1976? Are we moving forward? Have we really been changing as the situation in the world has changed? Are we dealing with quite a different situation now than we were in 1976 when we embarked on the large part of this journey? Mike, maybe I'm going to ask you to start off.
I think there are some constants that endure, but I think if you look back over the period covered by the three of us, a lot of things changed over time. The legal frameworks changed. Canadian values changed. Levels of knowledge about immigration, tolerance of immigration and immigration irregularities fluctuated during this period of time. There were times when refugees refugee meant saint, and there were other times when refugee meant criminal. And part of the job of civil servants is to take those waves into account, but also to keep a steady course and not get blown away one way or another. I think the things that remain constant are that all over the world people continue to move from bad situations to better situations. And Canada is one of the best situations on the planet. You wouldn't know it from reading our papers on a daily basis, but you just have to visit almost anywhere else. And so one of the constants, and it really began during my time in the 70s, is the people taking their fate in their own hands and trying to figure out how to get through the Canadian immigration system and the avenue of choice becoming the asylum seeker, the asylum system. And for the challenge of the ministers and the civil servants who manage these things to this very day is to manage the fact that the stream contains people who clearly are refugees, people who probably are refugees, and people who clearly are not, and to make sure that the continual battle is to It's not what to do about the refugees, because nobody has a stake in turning them away, and we have obligations to take them. The problem is, how can you keep the flow open so you can find the refugees in a stream that contains a lot of other people? And what do you do about those other people? Do you simply say, oh well, boys will be boys, and tolerate them? Or do you send messages to people coming here that way, that this is in the door, and you send that message by removing them? So there are constants, but in my time, the values have changed, certainly. Levels of tolerance have changed. Media interest has changed. And the attention that governments care to, the energy governments care to invest in managing what are difficult situations fluctuates almost, in my experience, literally from minister to minister.
Raph, do you want to add to?
Yeah, and I think what I've learned from this and from other aspects of my career is that there's no chance that a country like Canada would have absolute control over its borders. It was just too big, and the processes of law are not designed to work to suit administrative convenience. That you can boil it down and you can say, for instance, that there is a formal selection system for who comes into this country, but there's also an informal one, and it's existed in different forms over years. The most popular one currently is the refugee determination system. It brings into us refugees, and also brings us people who select themselves. Now, as much as we'd like to, there's never going to be a fast, expeditious, efficient system that sorts the deserving out from the undeserving, and a lot of the latter group are probably going to end up staying, and that's not a bad thing. What you need to do is ensure that the criminal elements are sifted out, and that the people who are using the system for other than ends for themselves and their family that coincide with Canadian values are also sorted out. But I guess the issue is here that you have to have in place a sufficiently credible system that discourages the worst forms of abuse. We know from our history that backlogs attract people into it who have nothing to do with the system that was set up to determine refugees, but they get in as opportunists to get work, to get student visas, to get whatever else, to get a presence in Canada. The other part is amnesties don't solve the problem unless you've got control of what caused the backlog. Terrific example, 1986, Walter McLean loses the fight on the design of the system, so he's given the opportunity to clean up. And he declares an administrative review to clean up the 25,000 case backlog, but we didn't have control of the system as it existed until 1989. Between 86 and 89, when we finally did get the new system into effect, we got 125,000 more claims, which were then amnestied to make room for the implementation of the new determination system. So backlogs attract, and amnesties don't clean up unless you've dealt with the underlying problem. But if you look at who Canada has received through these processes, you would quickly conclude that the success of these people, parallel to the success of the people who have been selected, is not all that different. So that we shouldn't be too paranoid. Again, as long as we sift out the really noxious elements within it, the people who threat Canadian security, the people who want to live a life of crime, and people who want to do things in social communities that just simply don't suit Canadian values.
Has the level of security changed? I mean, is this one of the things, if we look at what has shifted over the years? Certainly 9/11, we didn't talk a lot about that previously, but 9/11 certainly added a fear. Maybe it was one that has, in a sense, diminished now, but during the years after that, there was a lot of concern about security in the system. And is that something that shifted?
Yes, I think that has shifted. What 9/11 did was indicate to those people who had a rather rose-colored view of immigration, that there were elements to immigration that were unpleasant, that in fact could be very, very harmful. So it forced a lot of people to reconsider or rethink their kind of, the views that they had about immigration being by definition good. And that's something that was desirable. And it was an increasing realization, in my opinion, that immigration, like any other public policy, has to be managed so that you can sift between what is good and what is not good. And through my international experience, I can say that Canada, despite some of the opinion to the contrary, it was way ahead of most other Western countries in recognizing this and trying to do something about it, despite the obvious failures that we've also had. So I think that was a huge lesson that we learned from 9/11, that there are those people who will use the system in a way that was never designed for, and that has to be opposed.
Well, and certainly it started a bit of a different conversation with some of our partners in terms of looking at, can we work together to stop them before they ever get to our borders, and can we work together to make it clear that people are not welcome, and that we have to, if we're going to do it, we have to work together. So I'm thinking of the United States and some of the European countries for whom this discussion became very, very much more real after 9/11.
Yes, and it's interesting. I recall that before 9/11, I made a presentation in Australia at the IGC meeting in Australia, and Australia was the chair, on the way we deal with what we call 1F cases, that are cases of serious criminality involving United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, and the kind of bureaucratic structure that we put in place, how we were dealing with war criminals. And for most of the countries that were present at that meeting, that was stunning, that we were actually doing something like this. Particularly the Europeans had no concept of the fact that there could be criminals in the flow, and it came out in Europe a lot through the Afghan warlords that ended up in those countries, that got a lot of negative press attention. So slowly people had to start going that way. And what 9/11 did was just crystallize for any remaining doubters that this was an issue that really had to be responded to.
I think one of the changes that has happened, and it starts before 9/11. It starts with the aftermath of the Air India,
Yes.
Which actually was before 9/11 was the biggest terrorist hit up to that time, and that is that a lot of people in the academic world who had sort of poo-pooed security began to realize that no, there's something to this, and we're better off for the fact now that there is actually a whole stream of academics in this country and elsewhere, serious people doing serious work, and one hopes that what they come up with will help inform how we manage the security issues. But there's for anybody who sort of fundamentally believes that immigration is good for us, we've seen a number of examples in the last couple of years at just how these kind of terrorist threats, security threats, can make the life of whole sectors of our population much less enjoyable than they would have been had we been able to intercept these people when they came. Yeah. And so everyone has a stake in making sure that immigration is managed, and part of the management is weeding out and dealing with and interdicting and removing people who are going to be harmful to the society.
Well, why have we had so much trouble removing people? And we talked about this briefly, but maybe that's not our area. We haven't been necessarily enforcement people, but if you look at the issue of security and how it figures in our policy work, certainly I know after 9/11 it affected hugely the relationship that we had with the United States, because we were the butt of criticism that we were too soft, that our security systems weren't good, that our asylum system was breaking down, and therefore they were suffering because these people were going where they ultimately wanted to go, to the States. So have we progressed in that way?
Well, there are a number of specific issues in that environment that even with the best working machinery in the world, we won't achieve the result that we want. You get a country like Cuba that simply doesn't take people back, whatever they've done. So there's a huge impediment right there. Then you have people from countries in difficulty and revolution and in dictatorship who nationals can make a good case that on return they'll be tortured or worse. So we're impeded, even if the person concerned is a threat to our security. It becomes rather difficult. The Refugee Convention doesn't prevent us from doing it, but I think politically it becomes very difficult. And then just among the general population of people that we could remove, it's hard to find people in this country. If they don't want to be found, it's very hard to find them. And when resources are short, as they always are on that side of the departmental balance sheet, you don't spend a lot of time on the off chance you might find somebody.
I think this is an area in which there has been a lot of change since we started working on this file and at the present time. And the change is that we now live in a world where there's been a revolution in human rights. And that has expressed itself in a change in decision making from rather arbitrary, at the border decisions, no, you're not coming in, turn around and away you go, into a very legalized process where evidence is sifted and independent decision makers come to play, and there are appeal rights and so on. So suddenly, the way that you do your business has fundamentally altered, and we have to operate now within a framework that has changed so dramatically, not just in enforcement, but in refugee determination. It used to be one individual would take a look at a paper file and say yes or no, and that basically was it. And now, well, we've spent hours discussing what the now is. So that's a huge change in which the expression of the tension that exists inevitably between the need to manage a program in accordance with certain objectives and the fact that there are all kinds of people who don't want to be managed the way the program wants to manage them. And so you've got that, and they have all kinds of tools at their disposal now. And just one example, why do you think refugee claimants in such large numbers, in Sweden for example it was 90%, destroyed their documents? Because they've been told correctly that if they don't have documents, they can invent who they are, they can invent the story they have to tell, and if in the end it all fails, they have no document to send anybody back home to. You don't know what country they're from. So you get into these bizarre situations in which you have to hire a professor, a language expert in some obscure African language, to figure out where the guy comes from. So you get yourself into those situations, and that's the model.
You're dealing much more with organized movements of smuggling networks or things that really have been designed, in fact, to subvert the system.
Exactly.
So
And people smuggling is actually more lucrative and less dangerous than smuggling drugs. So
Right.
it's a big industry, and you get this odd symbiosis between what they in Asia they call the snakeheads, the people who organize these things, and the Canadian human rights constituency.
The question is, how do you get at the snakeheads or the organizers as
Exactly.
opposed to the victims?
Exactly.
And that's our continuing dilemma, and has been ever since. Whether when we were looking at the Chinese boat people, who were the people on the boat who were actually the organizers, and it was
Exactly.
very difficult to determine that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd like the instance where one of our more creative enforcement officers invented a one-way certificate to take people out of Canada who couldn't get travel documents. First flight went off to China under several escorts. 3 or 4 of these Chinese students with the document that we had invented. On arrival in Beijing, the Chinese arrested our escorts and sent the deportees back to us.
That they didn't recognize the documents.
But this is an example, again, of the change. When we started our careers, illegal migration was largely owned by amateurs.
Yes.
Family, friends, relatives, and so on would help, an employer would help, and so on. And then, as we responded to the situation by the imposition of visas, for example, as we responded by documents that had all kinds of security features and so on in, and we became successful, the people who wanted to come still wanted to come, but they could no longer rely on their own skills, so they had to go out and hire a professional. So by raising the bar, we've also raised the level of expertise needed to get around that bar. So this is one of the realities again, and these people are when we say they're professionals, we make no value judgment other than that they're good at what they do.
Let me maybe shift the topic here a little in the interest of time. I guess also in the area of change, all of you have talked about the role as a public servant in policy building of the outside person, the advocate, the human rights expert, the community advocate, the church person. We bring them all in and have discussions with them and try and find ways of finding common ground in the work that we do. Over the years, it's been easier, harder, difficult, easier. This evolves and shifts. How we see value, we see huge value. It's something we must do. We have an obligation as public servants. How do we talk about that and sort of work in that environment when you also have to deal with the broader public opinion of Canadians in the country and the opinions of those people who are advocates on behalf of people they think we are not handling properly? So have we seen change in how that happens? Has this shifted? Are we doing what we need to do?
I think it comes in waves. One of the things I think that was really heartbreaking in terms of the time that Raph and I sort of overlapped in this area was that there was during the Indo-Chinese movement, a whole different cohort of Canadians got interested and did real things like sponsoring people and paying for them to come in and looking after them. And there were frustrations about that. The groups got organized and couldn't understand why we couldn't deliver 60,000 people the following day. And there were some frustrations about that. But basically, when I left that job and left Canada to go to Geneva, I had thought that there had been a real shift in the relationship. There was a whole new set of allies out there, and that and things would and we would end up with a more of a partnership model, which is what we had during the Indochina period, which is what we run. And then, of course, the battles over the asylum system, which involved some very, very different perceptions about Canada's role in the world, led to a huge chasm between the people responsible for managing in government and people wanting to influence from out. And so I think first of all, for public servants, it's a bit complicated because it's the role of the elected members of Parliament to actually be talking to the broad public, much more than it is ours. But the fact is, the reality, when you get down into the nitty gritty, it's got to be done by civil servants. And I think it can sometimes be a real test of your professionalism to hear things that you don't like. I remember myself being involved in the Indochina thing and working like crazy with my own parish, and then something came along and the immigration department was denounced from the pulpit of my very own church. We didn't go back for several weeks. Um, and I think one of the things I think we all try to do is to build solid personal relationships, even with people we're arguing with. Mm-hmm. If you're successful in doing that, if you can separate the person from their role and try to be compassionate and understanding of the person, even if you're having to argue with them about what their objectives are, I think that's healthy. And you can, and I think we've all found cases that where you know at noon hour we're battling hammer and tongs, and then in the afternoon we all go out together and relate as human beings. I think that's an essential part of it. But we're a democracy, and we do have to listen, and we do have to, and even if there's some of the things are impractical or strike us as silly, you have to be respectful of what they're saying, and more importantly, be respectful of them, and then take the ideas back to work and see what you can work in and what you can't.
And that's excellent.
Yeah, I had to do some work recently on a theme that was developed by Axworthy. He redoes it at the university in Winnipeg. And he remarked that governments haven't learned how to engage the NGO community, and nor have the NGO community learned how to engage with government. And so I pursued that with Mr. Axworthy and other people on both sides of the issue. And his complaint was, and I've seen this happen firsthand, and as you probably have too, minister dedicates some scarce time to deal with an NGO group, and all he hears are whines and complaints. He doesn't hear any constructive proposals or anything the government at all can live with, but he hears the litany of what went wrong with this program or that policy. And so it's the kind of the orientation that needs to make government more receptive and needs to make the people making the input a bit more constructive. I remember, going to yet another meeting of the Canadian Conference on concern for refugees, and speaking to one of the leading delegates, and I said to her, why can't you ever give government credit for something that they did well? She said, that's not our role. We're here to criticize. And if we don't criticize, we won't get support from our own membership. And so it is you approach the dialogue from the point of view of, sooner or later, two negatives. So you're not going to get a lot of
It's interesting because progress. At one point in my career I spent a lot of time working with the voluntary sector for voluntary sector initiative was called, where government and voluntary sector were sitting down together trying to work out parameters for building better relationships. And there was a whole group that was looking at policy. And I mean, they built some fundamental principles on which we both needed to work. And it was clear that those sorts of things were implicit in them. And everybody agreed to them, and the government was very much, at the time, very much behind it. And then government shifted and it fell off, and those principles are still somewhere in somebody's file system, but they need to be reactivated. And I think there is a responsibility on both government and the voluntary sector side of things to be respectful and to come into these things with your own position clear. And they represent legitimate interests quite often, but if you make them heard in a way that's impossible to hear, then that's a problem.
Yeah. I think one of our failings overall has been a failure to appreciate sufficiently where the NGOs are actually coming from. They're one issue. Their issue, in our case, is refugees. We in government have a responsibility to all the aspects of that issue, and that results in an obvious tension, because a one-issue person, exactly as you said, Raph, is there to criticize those aspects of the issue that we have to manage, but that for them is not important. And so that we have to deal with that. But the other part of it is, certainly in the refugee area, the relationship with NGOs, with the voluntary sector, on the operational side has always been quite good.
Excellent, yeah.
And that's in the resettlement area. The relationship on policy has been much more difficult because of this one issue versus the multiplicity of issues that that has to be absorbed in any kind of legislation and policy that we have. But I think on our side, we were inadequate generally on reaching out at the most senior levels to senior people in the world out there. And I don't mean just NGOs. I also mean, I thought that we should have had lunch with chiefs of police. We should have dealt with people in the welfare, who run welfare offices and so on. And yet we didn't, because in one way, they complicate our lives. And I think there's sometimes a fear of complications like this. And yet in our world, where we say we want people to provide input, we're sometimes hesitant about that input because it just makes our complicated lives even more complicated.
If we look at the broader sort of public opinion, you step a little beyond some of the interest groups. Has public opinion shifted in any way over the period of time that we're talking here, as we've looked at how Canadians think about refugees and the arrival of refugees? And obviously there would be events that would impact their understanding and their opinion, but let's think a little about that. Has there been a shift? Is it more positive now towards refugees than it would have been back in 1976?
I think it's shifted in a number of ways. One, not the least of which, is that the children of those refugees are now responsible Canadian citizens, and they are by nature of their family's experience better informed, and that component of our population is increasingly large and important, well educated, etc. So I think there is a lot of knowledge there, and a lot of understanding there. I think sometimes some lessons never get absorbed. Others do. I have been quite surprised, for example, in the latest round of boat arrivals, how much less hysterical the public and media reaction has been. People still don't like it. But one of the fundamentals of Canada is, take your turn.
Yeah.
We don't like people who push ahead in the grocery line, and we don't like people who push ahead in the immigration queue either. It's one of those fundamentals that makes life livable in this country. And so there is when people hear about immigration scams and people trying to jump ahead and that sort of thing, even if they may be sympathetic to the individual case, once they learn about it, if they learn about it, there nevertheless is there's a sense that we have a set of rules, and if you're playing fast and loose with the rules, it's insulting to everybody in the country. People may or may not think our immigration system is fair, but you can't live in this country and look around and think that no immigrants are coming. The country has changed profoundly in our lifetime, and for the most part for the better. So I think people are generally, there's almost become a dogma in Canada that immigration is good for us and being good to refugees is good as well. And it's economists will look at it and say, well, really, immigration does make sense or it doesn't make sense, but mostly economics say it doesn't make that much difference at all. But I think the queue jumper, the people perceived to be queue jumpers, will always irritate the Canadian public, even though there's a fundamental orientation to be supportive of immigration, and I would say much more today than 25 years ago.
Okay, Raph, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think things have shifted. The legal environment is much more mature, and now they understand that not every charter issue requires a change in policy. That there are things in the charter prohibits which are reasonably sustainable in a democratic society like Canada. And so it takes some of the edge off the criticism that governments have to deal with on various issues. And if you take Jason Kenney's decision to rescind the medical benefits for claimants. I swear that if that had been launched in 1987, it would have got the sustained coverage that the kids in Montreal got with their strike against the hike in the fees. The government would have been hammered daily, and case histories would have been, shown to the public on the mass media, and to the point where the government would probably have backed off. But they've tried. The doctors have tried. The NGOs have tried, and they get a couple of columns in the paper, and it dies. Because essentially, the issue of fairness is there. These people get the coverage when they get recognized. And until they get recognized, they get the same coverage as any other uninsured visitor. And it's a question of, I think, more maturity and more understanding on the part of the public.
It's interesting, if you look at opinion polling, the public is generally to the right of the policy, generally. And that really comes out when there's a crisis in immigration, because then they say it's out of control and so on. If you ask them about how many immigrants we should take, no more than what we've got, or maybe less. And yet, if you take a look at that polling, and you take a look at those same questions asked in other countries, boy, do we fare well in comparisons. Generally, the public is nervous about immigration. It's more nervous about refugee claimants than almost probably any other area, simply because the paradoxes, the contradictions of the policy are so evident for everyone to see, and all the struggles that we have to deal with the groups that come in and abuse the system and so on. But the public at large is schizophrenic, the same way we all are, I think, with immigration. The public will say, keep them out, but as soon, or get them out. But as soon as it's somebody in their neighborhood, they say, but not my neighbor. And it reminds me of something that Arthur Kruger once said to me. He says, Gerry, he says, I've worked in about 8 or 9 different departments. And he says, and I've never seen a program, he says, where the contradiction between the logic of a policy position and it's being carried out is more at odds. In other words, it makes sense to have a removal policy. But the difficulty of doing that in each and every case is so obvious. So, and I thought, and I think it's absolutely true, and I think it's a really difficult situation, and why politically it is so difficult for a minister to deal with these human interest stories. As soon as the citizen carries a story, there's a good odds that within 3 days, there'll be another story and saying the minister sees reason, in other words, agrees with me. Yeah, so it's that kind of thing. But I think that overall public opinion is less in tune now than it used to be with the kind of, what Raph says, the kind of stories that are manufactured or made by the community, by the advocacy community on behalf of a certain policy principle or so on. Because I think they've gone to the well too often and cried wolf, and it doesn't have the staying power anymore because people don't buy into it anymore.
Well, I think that the public don't necessarily, in a sense, recognize that there are things like class action suits that happen out there when the advocacy groups are not, that doesn't seem to influence public opinion. It's just fact of life that sort of puts the policy machinations in some kind of hiatus for a while. But let me maybe just ask another question around this discussion, and if we were sitting in any other country than Canada, would we be having the same discussion? Is this unique to Canada? Is it unique to a certain small number of countries? Would it be a different dialogue that would be happening in other countries? You've all had lots of experience with other countries. Who wants to jump in?
Well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Yeah, I think Gerry's comment about how people perceive immigrants, however they got here, is germane to this discussion. At the end of the day, Canadians are comfortable with other people coming in to be integrated into the mainstream. And that is so different from how immigrants are regarded, even in Europe, where begrudgingly they allow people in when they need them to work, but there's not the same degree of acceptance that these people then should be integrated, because they're working, producing, part of the environment. They should be integrated, fully into society. And so when they approach tough policy questions like refugee determination, they approach them with the view, well, none of these people have right to be here. So how can we deal with that? Rather than, there are certain people who are here and who are going to stay here, so let's get them through the system and into an integrating mode while we dispose of the others that are, essentially illegal migrants. And so it makes the discussion here so much more realistic, because at the end of the day, the people who aren't criminals are probably going to stay. And the thing is to not poison public opinion against them, and to, again, curb the worst forms of abuse, however it occurs, but to reassure Canadians that the program is being managed, and that the participants in it, one way or another, will end up as your neighbors.
I remember an instance where around the time that the system that Raph designed was being implemented, there was an effort by some of the enemies of that system, who brought a large number of European NGOs to Canada to see this atrocity that was about to be committed. And they took them out to the airport in Toronto, and managed to, and got them talking to some of the immigration officers. And it totally backfired, because what the officer's first concern is, of course, we have to make sure that we identify the refugees in this thing, because we have to protect them. And so the NGOs went back to Europe thinking, boy, these, even the officials in Canada want to protect refugees. It's something we want to do, and I think that's really fundamental to the mentality of the people in the department who work on refugees, is that we all recognize, possibly because so many of us come from immigrant families that are here because of war or other things, and there's not that many families in Canada that are that removed from that experience, that we can see ourselves in those shoes. And so I think that's it. And I think our geography is very helpful in terms of we have lots of space, we have lots of resources, we have a neighbor that keeps us amused and sometimes terrified, but nevertheless it's not all that threatening compared to any other neighborhood you can think of on the planet. And so I think there's as opposed to even the other countries that resettle immigrants in large numbers, I think somewhere along there, back in the 60s, early 70s, the notion of this country has never been a monocultural country to begin with, okay? But somewhere along the line, something clicked in our psychic shared consciousness, that we began to sort of enjoy diversity rather than be threatened by it. I mean, the food sure got better. The life in the cities got better, and I think I think we may sometimes push it to ludicrous extremes in terms of accommodating this and accommodating that, but nevertheless, I think Canadians, from an all-white, rather xenophobic country where, my dad grew up in Toronto and reported seeing signs walking to school, help wanted, no Irish, help wanted, Catholics need not apply. That kind of a country, somewhere in the 60s and the early 70s, that country disappeared and something different came along. It's not nirvana, it's not perfect, It's just a hell of a lot better than anything else on the planet.
Yeah. Gerry.
Yeah. I think what you have to recognize, that we compare ourselves to other countries, that immigration is we see it as part of nation building. We see it part of our national myth. It's one of our myths that immigration is what built this country. Europe doesn't feel that way, nor should it, because immigration, at least in times immemorial, hasn't built Europe. So Europe feels that culturally, nationally, it is complete.
Yeah.
It also, Europe, I think, subconsciously feels that they are still a country of immigrants.
Yeah.
They sent, in the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, about 65 million people to other parts of the world. That's still part of their consciousness. And so that's why Europe, even at a time that it receives immigrants on a per capita basis almost at our level, still psychologically still doesn't see itself as that. If you take a look at even the United States, because in the United States there's not as positive an attitude towards immigration, in large part because they haven't managed it as well, if I may say so, as we have, because we don't have 10 to 12 million illegals, which, if you have a large number of illegals, I guarantee you, they will cloud the issue to such an extent that people start arguing about that rather than about other immigration-related issues.
Let's leave it there and just say that it's been a really interesting discussion, and there is much more to say, but we won't say it today. And I thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.